Thank you. And my name's Carmine Sibio, and I'm the global chairman and CEO of EY. And we are sponsors of the Green Horizons Summit at COP26. And I'm excited to have Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, with us today, and also the co-chair of SMI, the Sustainable Markets Initiative. So Brian, welcome, and thank you for doing this. And so I want to kind of get right into it, Brian, and maybe for everyone, we're all doing a lot of work trying to mobilize capital to get capital to investable projects around the world to help in terms of really transitioning to a low carbon environment. And you and I have had many conversations, and you've been really spearheading a lot in terms of SMI. Let's start with Brian, maybe just giving everyone a sense of what is SMI, what's the purpose, what are we trying to accomplish?
Well, thanks, Carmine, and I want to thank you and all your colleagues at your firm for all the great work you've done to help us with all this, and it's been fun working with you and your colleagues. But I think that at its heart, the Sustainable Markets Initiatives is a coalition of the willing, a coalition of private sector CEOs working with His Royal Highness Prince Charles and all of us to motivate the private sector to move faster. And so at its heart, that's what it is, a coalition of the willing. And when we convene these groups of CEOs and started these task forces and all the work that goes on with it, not only CEOs, but all the talent people working for it, it always comes back to that. We are trying to do this faster, and working together in certain elements, we know we can speed it up. And then that's at its heart what it is. And then the second thing is it then has a set of principles operates under the Terra Carta. It has a set of principles which we operate the thing, which is to figure out real practical things and try to do them. One of which is the work that you've engaged with your Big Four colleagues to try to figure out how to get projects more investable. And so we've also said we're a coalition of the willing, and we're a do tank, not a think tank. So what can we do? And I think we've seen some great progress on that. But then we have a philosophical underpinning led by His Royal Highness, which is the Terra Carta, and the idea that, look, the private sector can't say they're going to do it, they have to do it. And things like the Terra Carta mark and the Terra Carta itself and the words, I think, in a children's book that explains it, these are all important things so people see, philosophically, and it's where our North Stars are in terms of how we go about it. But it's 200 CEOs, 10 trillion in market cap, millions of employees, trillions of dollars, tens of trillions or hundreds of trillions of investable assets. It's got all these large companies, but that's the essence of it.
Yeah. No, thanks, Brian. And we're happy to be part of this. As you know, we and the other Big Four have been doing work in different areas around the world, on the ground projects, having people on the ground really helping to develop the project, but then also creating some technology so we can gather data so it makes investing much easier. And you mentioned in terms of what SMI is, and obviously you have set up different sectors and different committees. And we are working closer and closer with the Financial Services Committee in terms of how are we really going to move capital from private capital into these projects. So, a lot of times we're trying to figure out the barriers. So from your point of view, what are the barriers today, and what else can we be doing to help mitigate the barriers?
Well, first of all, it's just knowledge. What other projects? And there's not a nice repository for that, and you guys are building out technology to allow that to sort of be understood better. And by the way, there's other people doing it too, but that's part of the problem. We have a lot of people kind of doing as opposed to here's a repository. And the multilateral development banks have information, but sort of what other projects? And then the question is, what could make those projects bankable? And what we mean by that is not literally, the bank financing, but what makes them bankable, which means they have to have, the risk mitigated, possible risk mitigated around currency risk or political risk, which may be the role of certain players. It may need a little concessionary capital just because the nature of the project is different. It may need some, blended finance, those types of things, or just may need regular way private capital. It may be bigger and smaller. In other words, there's one we talked about last week at our SMI meeting was $1 billion equity went into a water supply in a city. There's lots of $1 million investments that are needed. So the idea is really to find those projects and then find out what's between them, which can be the money, the structure, some of the risks around them, or the permitting practices. A lot of times people say, we want this, but then you say, okay, now let's build it. And they're saying, well, that's a 12-year approval process. So that kills a project. So what we're trying to find out is really, what are the projects and what are the obstacles, and how do we, frankly, get everybody to work on the same page in these developing countries and less rich countries to accelerate it, because frankly, there is a lot of money and a lot more money coming. And in the end of the day, we're scaling some of the sectors that weren't used to scale. In other words, philanthropy and NGO practice almost inherently is hard to scale, and we've seen that in other types of things, other environment. What we're trying to do is scale them by common principles, not necessarily making one big organization.
Brian, talk a little bit more. You and I have had conversations around the development banks and what can the development banks do more to help and facilitate. And this gets into them taking some risk and first layer risk. Where do we stand with that? And is that something that's moving along? And what's been the attitude of the development banks?
Well, we at the SMI issued a paper recently about that. What are the key 4 or 5 points? And I think actually in learning more about this, Carmine, people like yourselves and me in our position, we've learned a lot about this over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of all these different things. And so the development banks are, the World Bank and African Development Bank and Asian Development Bank. These are wonderful institutions. And by the way, there's a whole different set of them that are what they call DFIs or something that are more semi-private that provide funding too. Yet, the total, the balance sheet of all of them is not near what the private sector can bring. And so we got to go back. We need, $2-3 trillion a year to make the transition happen. It needs to be a just transition, which is just as all players have to be able to make the transition. We have to help them make it. And all countries and all citizens have to have the benefit of power and electricity and things like that as you make the transition. So the development banks have been out there, but the 2-3 trillion a year overwhelms them immediately in terms of size and dynamic. So the question is, how do you make 1 and 1 equals 3? How do you use their capital where, look, they get paid back. Let's be point blank about it. For the private sector lenders have gone into some countries and the ebbs and flows of what's gone on, hyperinflation, political change, whatever, they would then lose their courage. These projects by definition are 10, 20-year projects because you can't build a water system or sewage system or a new energy system and say it's over in 3 years. It takes time. And so the development banks have this unique role where they've been doing this, but we just need more money. And so the question is, can you take their capacity and use it, 10 cents on the dollar to get the other 90 cents from private sector, as opposed to they do all 10 cents and do the 10-year financing on the project, sort of the mortgage financing type of long-term financing. And, both are good, but we might be able to get the $2 trillion, $3 trillion in the faster if we do that. So what we're asking very specifically is, take more of the political and first loss type currency risk away, be more of the catalytic capital, the first part of the blended finance tool with philanthropy maybe. And then 3, even potentially take some of your old projects to create more capacity for yourself and sell them off because they're deep in the money and understood that the private sector may take away. And then 4th, work with the insurers who may be able to wrap these things once you kind of get them aggregated and they're not figuring out 17 mid-sized projects, they can wrap them. So John Neal and the team working from Lloyd's has some ideas there, but it's really to make them a catalytic finance agency as opposed to an end lender type agency. Now they do this, but they do it for a small part of what they do as opposed to all what they do. And that's the question we're asking of G7, G20, others is, why don't we push in that direction? Because there are, like the African Development Bank is very aggressive in this area, others aren't so much. And so we're trying to figure out, can we nudge them along faster so we then can bring all this money on top of it?
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. I've been on a few calls with you, a few Zoom calls and Zoom meetings where you've had the development banks on, as well as with Prince Charles and as well as with government officials to encourage them more and more to do this. And so, Brian, in terms of government in general, how can government help in terms of helping the private sector and helping ease the investments in these projects? One is, encouraging the development banks, and frankly, maybe more than encouraging the development banks, but telling them that this is something that is good for everyone. Are there other areas where government should be more helpful here?
Well, I think in general, we are advocating overall for signals, and some of those signals would be a price on carbon. Obviously would be an easy one, but it's a hard one politically. And so we understand that, but even giving a more objective statement to the value of carbon offsets, the value of carbon reduction that they would agree with the calculation, right? Not a tax, but just a number, and make it standard across jurisdictions, then allows, a United States company that needs offsets to go spend them in a developing country for a project like this that we can identify and know that that's good credit, and know the dollar volume of credit is worthwhile. And so some is just helping a price on carbon. Another one is, again, working with the development banks, as we talked about, to reshape them. Another is mandates, right? And so, we talk about this in a lot of ways, but the simple one I think we've gotten people's sort of imagination on was to say, mandate a percentage of sustainable aviation fuels in the airline industry. By the way, the airline industry participants in SMI are fine with this and kind of doing it themselves. But if you do it and make it even, then people can have competitive arbitrages on this fuel is more costly, and give some time. And the UK, I think, did this last week, the week before. What that kind of mandate creates a market. So now there's demand. If it's 10% of all the kerosene burned by the planes, that's a big number. And if you sit there and say, okay, now we can start to build plants and we can finance those plants just literally on that offtake contract, allows you to do the 2 or 3 years of buildup. Now, it may overwhelm the capacity today, but we're not talking about building a future. So mandate's another one. So, and then the permitting. I always, whether this is deployment of 5G or, whatever else, public transportation, the issue comes back to private sector can't wait years and years to do things. So example is used on the SAF is there was a specific project that was trying to get permitted and they just thought it would take 7 years. And so you got 7 years for production into an uncertain thing. No one's going to come in. So what I'd say is the governments is with mandates, with the offset calculations and enabling the offset market to get a lot bigger by a good indicative price, a good indicative validity of offset. There's too much debate about it, and the people who actually certify them aren't big enough to keep up with it. An ability to standardize disclosure that offsets like this will get to the value, permitting, those are all the things. And frankly, the other one, and when we go back to the MDBs, not only what they do, but also how do we create common pools of information across, so we don't have it sitting in buckets in places. So how do we have the government incent, especially the big governments who have the money and 100 billion are supposed to put in the less rich countries, say those countries, okay, we'll start putting the money in, but you got to make sure the projects are organized and coming out along the lines that you and your colleagues have worked on. Would just speed up the whole process. And those are kinds of things I think they could do. So it's regulation, it's mandates, it's the MDBs, it's permitting. It's also pushing the standard of engagement with the private sector up so it happens faster.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on the regulation around offsets in particular. As you say, we're always learning in these roles in terms of these types of things, and I've been learning a lot about offsets more recently, and it gets incredibly complicated. And so more standardization, more regulation, I guess, in terms of what do offsets mean and so forth is so important, because I've heard so many different definitions on what's a good offset, what's not a good offset, and it gets very complicated very quickly. So I couldn't agree with you more on that.
I think, Carmine, the key on the offsets, you've got to go back to the sort of business system, which is a net zero commitment by a company, whether it's your service firm or my bank and service firm or an operating company, you pick it. Requires them it basically produces an internal tax on the carbon they can't mitigate in their base operations. And so we're about 91% totally mitigated. So we got to buy offsets for the other 9%. And the problem with that is then, okay, now the process to buy them is a long, arduous, and what works in the debate about is standing forest preserved versus new forest planted versus all that stuff. And by the way, that number is going to go up if you start going from our base operations of scope 1, 2 to 3, where we're now talking about offsetting financed emissions. That number is going to go up just when it's even harder to find them. And so I think, saying, 10 is 10 or what 20 is 20 or 50 is 50 for a number that it's worth on terms of what a unit of carbon's worth. But importantly, then saying one of the roles they play either through formal, just like a rating agency, they don't have the rating agency, but they make the rating agency valuable by how they're treated in regulation, if a ratings and things like that, and whether it's insurance and stuff, they can create, a broader offset field out there to help us and also regulate it, in some ways, regulate the offset players to make it real. Then you and I aren't trying to figure out, what's the difference between this one, that one, and this one, is we are basically buying it. And then you can see actually the trading markets really mature. And those trading markets really maturing allow not us, big companies like ours, but little companies that need, let's say that we're a distributor with 50 trucks. that's sending out food or whatever, kind of things. We need to buy those offsets too, but we don't have the staff that we have here at Bank of America, or you do, that, can figure this all out. They just need to go to market and say, here's a $500,000 or whatever their offset number is, and be done with it, but we got to know it's quality, because you add that up across, our 30,000 middle market clients and start to do the math, and the numbers are staggering. But it all comes from net zero, needing the offsets, needing the market, and then that money becomes the seed money to help drive the next round of improvements. And you just now have a virtuous circle. So as I always say, it's the old analogy of the windmill. The inside, you look at the inside windmill, it looks like it's barely turning, but you go out to the ends, in the bridge from the middle to the ends is the net zero commitment, to the ends is the offset, and that means these projects go fast.
Now, that's fair. So Brian, just lifting it up a level. So COP, what do you expect to happen by the end of COP, and then what do you expect to happen going forward?
Well, I think COP has already had its impact before we get there, in a sense that all the efforts went in. So just thinking about finance broadly, and so we had the work in the SMI that we've done with the Financial Services Task Force. We've had the work at looking at the project capabilities which you have. So that got a lot of financial people aware of it, but not only banks, but asset managers, asset owners, and private equity firms are in this group too. So they're all looking at this, and they say, oh my gosh, I can see all this opportunity, all this ability. So you look at finance in the SMI, you look at finance in the GFANZ world with Mark Carney's work to bring everybody together and agree a set of principles. You look at finance in the offset world, where the IIF and Bill Winters and the group and Mark came together with a view of that. You look at finance in the WEF context, the World Economic Forum context. So, we really enjoy the SMI because of the focus of it and stuff. But all these other groups are doing good things. Then Secretary Kerry got a commitment from the financial institutions in the President Biden's summit, and 4 or 5 months ago. And so what you end up doing is you have trillions of dollars of financing commitments on the table across all the major banks in the United States and in Canada and in the UK and in other parts of the world. So just on finance, that's all gone on because COP26 was there. That it forced us all to move and think hard about it together and get it done. Now COP26 happens, then we got to keep that going, because that money's got to be deployed and our clients got to make the transition. But I think COP26, before you get there, that people can't diminish how important it was. That's just finance. And you could do that across airlines. You could do that across any other industry. But just across finance, you see you've gone from where it was a fairly disorganized, when you talked about net zero in our industry, people like, how many heads do you have, to where we have a playbook produced by the SMI for any bank could figure out how to get to net zero, what the practice of getting net zero is. It's not how to get there, but practice. So I think that's what COP26 is about. It forces commitments on the table. If they get the Paris reaffirmation right and the $100 billion, that would be spectacular. They've gotten commitments from across economies with Lok Sharman, the team working on it, and the UN and others that I think are up to 70% or something of all the economies of the world are committed to net zero. And again, those commitments then drive activity, and activity then frees up money, resources, everything, and the urgency moves. And I think, meanwhile, the science is being refreshed and put on a table, and the urgency. And so, I just think that these things are good to remind people you are making progress, and and we are moving, and they provide catalytic, a thought process. But when you go, the key that we all got to remember is the day after COP ends, we had to do what we had to do the day before, which is keep making progress, keep doing these things, and driving them in a genuine, just transition mode. And I think that's what COP's about, is to force the commitments out, and then the activity follows, I think.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's just great to see that the private sector is working with the public sector on this issue, on the overall issue, because 2 years ago, I don't think that was the case at all. I think the public sector maybe didn't even like the private sector involved. The private sector was the bad carbon emitters and so forth. So to me, a lot's happened over the last couple years, really. And also, I would say all countries are involved. And if we're talking more about the public sector, there's more conversation. Even you and I, Brian, reside in the U.S. and even the U.S., I think 2 years ago, the conversation was completely different than it is today. And now when I talk to all our clients around the U.S., one of the first topics is all around sustainability and what's happening and how do I change what I do. And how do we encourage everyone else to do that? Where 2 years ago, 18 months ago, it absolutely was not the conversation. So I do think from that perspective, the whole COP organization is and getting everyone there is exactly what you said. It's a lot of what's happened, even getting to it. But we have to make more and more progress. And I do think governments are going to play a big role, in particular what happens with India and China in terms of going forward. If we're all going to get to the goal of 1.5, everyone's got to play. I always say it's got to be the private sector, the public sector, individuals, everyone on the planet's going to have to play.
I think,
Brian, is there any more advice for the attendees and anything that you want to tell them?
I think, Carmine, the advice, so if whether you're public sector, private sector, advocates, NGOs, whoever it is, the idea, this is a big task and everybody's got to be doing lots of things in it. And, we'll have people try to calculate whether it's exactly 1.5 or 1 3/4. But the reality is it's going to be nothing unless tomorrow we make steps. And that's, just what you said, Carmine, is what is completely different over the last 3 or 4 years is the commitments by governments fulfilling what was embedded in really the SDGs in Paris, the basic idea that all governments agree that they're going to conduct themselves some way. By companies faced with their shareholders, their clients, their teammates saying, hey, we can't ignore this anymore. This is the right thing to do. And then, then all the other communities, and that's the amazing thing. So the advice is everybody move, everybody do, everybody try to do it. And you and I've worked on this metrics and things. If we spend all the time debating whether 1 and 1 is equal to 2 or 1 and 1 equal to 2.145 or something like, you get into these questions that you just have to sit back and say, whoa. If we do less tomorrow in terms of our own consumption in every company and every enterprise and every college, every university, every school, every government, every household across the world, we do less in consumption. And then we figure out how to reposition the major things we knew, the grid, away from the fossil fuel, the worst sources over time, and the transition and how we do it. That will make this happen, because 8 billion people working on it is a lot different than 10, 15, even 100 million people working on it. And that's what I think COP represents. But I think that's the advice: just go out and do things, and trust each other that the genuineness of the commitments to do things is real, but hold people accountable over time.
Great. Brian, I got to tell you, I got to just give you a big thank you. Brian Moynihan, not only does he run one of the biggest banks in the world and is doing a fantastic job as CEO of Bank of America, but the amount of time I've spent with Brian really focused on this issue, on climate overall and sustainability overall, has been terrific. What you're driving, Brian, at SMI and beyond SMI has been terrific. So I congratulate you and I thank you from everyone, really, from all the business, public sector, private sector, in terms of what you're doing. Thank you so much for your insights, and thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of this.
Thank you, Carmine. And our job is to deliver profits for our shareholders and for society. And in this area, it's an area we have to do it. So we're pleased to help.